All right, today we're going to take a journey back to a time that feels familiar, but we're going to look at it from a world you might not recognize. We're going beyond the big names to uncover some of the unseen influencers, these spiritual currents that were flowing just beneath the surface right around the time of Jesus.
So you have to ask yourself, who else was out there? I mean, beyond the stories we all know, first-century Palestine was this incredibly vibrant, complex landscape of different beliefs and practices. Today, we're going to zero in on two really fascinating groups that walked that very same ground.
Okay, so first things first, let's set the scene. It's so important to get this. The spiritual world back then was anything but monolithic. It wasn't one single belief system. It was this dynamic, bubbling environment filled with all these different sects, and each one had its own unique way of looking at scripture and life.
This timeline really helps put it all into perspective. You can see right here, the Essenes, they were already an established group, well before Jesus was even born. But the Nazarenes, they pop up right around the time of his ministry. And it's that overlap that creates such a fascinating spiritual backdrop for everything.
So, let's dive into our first group, the Essenes. The best way to think of them is as these desert purists. They were a community that basically chose to step away from mainstream society to go live this life of intense spiritual discipline out near the Dead Sea.
These Essenes had this highly structured communal life where absolutely everything was shared. They practiced self-denial, they had super strict daily rules for everything, but at the very heart of it all was this quest for something called gnosis.
So what even is gnosis? This is a really key term for understanding these groups. See, gnosis isn't just about learning from books. It's about seeking direct, personal spiritual knowledge, this idea of revealing hidden truths. And this concept, it's a thread that's going to connect the groups we're looking at today.
Now let's move on to our second group and see how this all builds. The Nazarenes. They showed up a bit later as a brand new movement that grew directly out of this spiritually charged environment, but they had one major new focus.
You can probably spot some similarities with the Essenes right away, can't you? The communal living, the asceticism, and there it is again, gnosis. But here's the difference. Unlike the Essenes who went out into the desert, the Nazarenes lived within existing towns, and their defining feature was an all-consuming focus on following the teachings of Jesus.
When you put them side by side like this, the distinctions become crystal clear. You've got the Essenes, isolated out in the wilderness, active before Jesus, and hyper-focused on strict Jewish law. Then you have the Nazarenes, living in scattered communities, emerging during Jesus' time, with their entire focus revolving around his specific teachings. And this, of course, brings us to the real mystery here, the core of our explainer, the Jesus connection. How do all these threads, the Essenes, the Nazarenes, and Jesus himself, how do they all weave together?
Well, the thing is, there's no simple answer. It's still a huge subject of debate among scholars. We don't have definitive proof, but the evidence invites these fascinating questions. Was Jesus an Essene, a Nazarene, or was he maybe just inspired by these powerful spiritual ideas that were circulating all around him at the time?
So why do scholars even think there's a connection? Well, it all comes down to these shared ideals. Take the communal lifestyle, for example. The Essenes completely renounced private property. They held everything in common. That's a radical idea that echoes so powerfully in the early Nazarene communities, where followers were said to have sold their possessions and shared them with all. The parallels are they're too strong to ignore.
For centuries, a lot of this was just speculation, pieced together from little historical fragments. But then, a modern discovery in the 20th century completely changed the game. It gave us a direct window into this ancient world.
The turning point was 1947. A shepherd boy, a cave, and a discovery that would literally rewrite history. This single event gave us more information about these ancient spiritual groups than scholars had ever dreamed possible.
The impact was just profound. So first, ancient texts that nobody even knew existed were uncovered. Then, from those texts, the daily practices and deep beliefs of these communities were revealed in stunning detail. And with all that new information, brand new links between these groups and the history of the time were forged.
And you have to understand, the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just a few little fragments. We're talking about an entire library. They gave us this first-hand look into the teachings, the rituals, the whole worldview of communities like the Essenes, pulling them out of the fog of history and into sharp focus. Which really just leaves us with this final thought. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls proves that history is not a closed book. It really makes you wonder, what other secrets, what other communities, what other unseen influencers are still buried out there, just waiting for the right moment to be discovered, and to change everything we think we know about the past?